Consciously or not, when someone mentions Milton, most who have experienced its built form naturally contemplate the scale of the downtown core, and principally its largely historic, commercial, and institutional architecture. Chief amongst the structures that have helped to define the perspective that most would ascribe to urban Milton's physical form are three of the community's most iconic buildings. Grace Anglican Church, which anchors the east end of the historic downtown core from a gently sloping hill. Knox Presbyterian Church, nestled majestically in the commercial core. And St. Paul's United Church, which anchors the west end of the downtown core, overlooking it from a point well above the 16-Mile Creek floodplain. Beyond the Niagara Escarpment and the family farm, rural Milton's physical identity is also significantly defined by church architecture. But there's more to Milton's rural and urban churches than their architecture. The fact of the matter is that the oldest organization in our community is the church and its various denominations. Christian churches came before educational institutions, fraternal lodges, service clubs, any of the municipalities that make up Halton regionally as we know it today, or even Canada and the province of Ontario for that matter. Canada itself was founded on Christian orthodoxy. Here are 5 key points, all of them too often forgotten or simply not known by too many Canadians. Canada's 1982 Charter of Rights and Freedoms contains a non-legal preamble that states that Canada was founded on principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. Number 2, Canada's 1960 Bill of Rights stated that the Canadian nation is founded on principles that acknowledge the supremacy of God, the dignity and worth of the human person, and the position of the family in a society of free men and free institutions. It affirms also that men and institutions remain free only when freedom is founded upon respect for moral and spiritual values and the rule of law. Number 3, Canada is formally known as the Dominion of Canada. The use of the word dominion comes from the Psalm 72 in the Old Testament. Number 4, Canada's motto, Ameri Usque et Mari, or from sea to sea, also comes from Psalm 72 in the Old Testament. And number 5, there have been changes to our national anthem following World War I and again earlier this year. God keep our land glorious and free remains. Longtime local historian Jim Dills has written a dozen or more local books of history over the last 40 years, and Milton area churches is our third collaboration. One could argue that it is the most significant piece of writing that either of us has ever done. Why? No local, provincial, or national history is complete or accurate without a discussion about Christian churches and their role in helping to forge what ultimately became Canada. So let's have that discussion tonight. Settlers in the 1820s brought with them their Christian faith and an eagerness in the new land to establish places of worship, whether in town or country. One of the earliest recorded church services in the area was that conducted by the Reverend William Jenkins from the township of Markham, who preached in June 1820 on the farm of Andrew Laidlaw on Lot 6 in the 4th concession of a squeezing. The people sat around him on logs, and his pulpit, by the side of which he stood, was a maple stump. He visited in the neighborhood, baptized children, and organized the congregation. In 1824, land was obtained from Mr. Laidlaw, and the following year, the barn-style meeting house, now called Boston Church, was erected. On September 10, 1827, Methodist saddlebag preachers Reverend Anson Green and Brother Black rode together along the Lakeshore Road towards their new assignments. Mr. Black turned north at the Credit River, and Reverend Green continued west. That Sunday, Green preached at Munn's Schoolhouse in what is now known as Oakville and Palermo. On Monday, he was at Joseph Bowes, near the present Masonic Hall, once Bowes Church, which is in Milton, of course. On Tuesday, he preached in the village of Milton at Widow Harrison's at the west end of Main Street, and at Mr. James Coates near Tremaine Road and Derry Road. Shortly afterwards, Christian church buildings began to appear in waves. Their activities were the communal glue of early communities. In the 13 years between 1846 and 1859, the first buildings of all denominations that would serve the small Milton settlement into the 20th century had been built. It was a time when the original community's foundations would be laid. In 1854, the community of Milton was designated the county town, and in 1857 the town of Milton, the municipal entity, was incorporated as separate from Trafalgar Township. A Trafalgar census in 1899, including the towns of Oakville and Milton, showed that there were 31 churches, 12 Methodist, 5 Presbyterian, 5 Church of England, 3 Roman Catholic, 2 Colored Methodists, 2 Salvation Army, 1 Baptist, and 1 Disciples. When one looks back at the most significant events that have occurred in our nation's history over the last 150 years, the churches were there, offering organization, support, and hope while coping with the change that was sure to follow. During World War I, churches were the gathering place for the many memorial services held as news of casualties reached the town and the countryside. Fuel shortages affected services and led to unions of churches to conserve. Even the council of the day decided to save on expenses by discontinuing the ringing of the town bell at Sunday's service times. Churches and all public gatherings were discontinued during the Spanish influenza outbreak of 1918. Thanksgiving services for the end of the war were deferred to December. The advent of electricity brought about improvements in church infrastructure that further enhanced its place in the community. Regular events often included the annual turkey suppers, Christmas concerts, and bazaars, while churches filled the time between services with community center activities until changing transportation methods made longer trips possible. One contemporary of the times noted that a few years ago, good roads meant large church attendance. Today, good roads mean a smaller attendance. There were difficult social times as the Depression-era years required preparation of bales to send west and benevolent work done locally. There were also tent meetings and jubilee singers, stage plays, and traveling groups. Heavily drifted roads affected travel, and radio programs began to develop followings. As early as the 1940s and in the middle of another war, the topic of commercialized sport on Sundays drew protests. Regulations took a new turn. In 1941, churches serving meals at a charge required a license to purchase the required food products during periods of rationing. But society was changing, and with that, church attendance practices were changing too. Sunday school found it difficult to compete with Sunday sports. Interesting radio programs that drew faithful listeners had been supplanted with television. Churches united. Some built expanded buildings. Religious education classes were discontinued in elementary schools. New curricula with books and colorful papers were not enough. But churches continued to mark centennials and move on. The variety of denominations, the changing social patterns, the demands for time, new entertainments, and extended commutes for two-income families have all had an impact on the role of the churches. The early settlers, the latest new residents, all seek a social center. In the pattern of settlement, the church provided it. But regardless of how the religious side of the ledger changes, the institutional component of the community's built form, specifically its churches, will likely stand the test of time through this century. How these structures are used by the community will change over time as the needs of their respective congregations evolve. Some churches will be sold to other churches, as was the case a few years ago when Redemption Hill Church purchased Bethel United Church. And some churches will be sold for redevelopment, as was the case recently when Southside Community Church was conditionally sold for commercial purposes. New religious institutions representing both new and existing faiths will be constructed, as is the case with St. Matthew's Malankara Mar Thoma Syrian Church and the impending development of a new Roman Catholic church in Milton. Other churches will simply close and lie dormant as parishioners look elsewhere for spiritual nourishment. Through readings, research, interviews, and other investigations that resulted in the formation of the contents of the book, Jim and I learned that there isn't a church in Milton that hasn't been altered, added to, renovated, changed, or rebuilt from what was originally constructed. The most recent examples include St. Paul's United Church, Knox Presbyterian Church, and Redemption Hill Church. But there will be others in the years and decades to come. I've talked about the history of the church in our community and its significance to Milton, its significance to Ontario, and its significance to Canada. I'm going to conclude my comments this evening by commenting on church architecture. The design of some early local churches is quite plain relative to others, but it is often the case that an ornately detailed interior can be found inside a simple exterior. In many local churches, religious artifacts, wood carvings, stained glass windows, and fresco-covered plasterwork are often strikingly beautiful. While some Canadian churches were built during the Baroque period of architecture, most, including many constructed in Milton over the last almost 200 years, were designed in the Gothic Revival style. This architectural design was imported from Great Britain and the United States as well in the early 19th century, and became the most popular style for churches through the 19th century to the early 20th century in Canada. The Gothic Revival period lasted longer and was more thoroughly embraced in Canada than in either England or the US, only falling out of style in the 1930s. The late 19th and early 20th centuries was also the period when many major Canadian institutions were formed. Throughout Canada, many of the most prominent religious, civic, and scholastic institutions are housed in Gothic Revival style buildings. In the 1960s and 1970s, several scholars, most notably Alan Gallons, embraced Canadian Gothic Revival architecture as one of the nation's signature styles and as an integral part of Canadian nationalism. While largely abandoned in the modernist period following World War I, several postmodern architects have embraced Canada's neo-Gothic past. Its primary features, like pointed arch windows, cross denominations, and physical sizes, from simple log cabins like the original St. Peter's Mission Church in what was rural Milton, to elaborate stone structures like Grace Anglican Church in Milton's historic downtown core and St. George's in rural Milton. Almost every design element in both historic and contemporary Milton churches is a mixture of architecture, church history, social circumstances at the time of construction, theology, and of course, cost. As much as church architecture matters to individual Miltonians who may not necessarily be affiliated with a given place of worship, but still have an affection for the exterior design of the structure, a church's architecture matters most to its congregation. And while the use of Gothic Revival design in local churches crosses denominations, there are both subtle and significant differences between them. These architectural interpretations provide visual clues as to what is important to a given religious faith and helps to enunciate its spiritual values. Peter Robertson and Douglas Robertson probably explained it best in their book on the subject several years ago. In Canadian Churches and Architectural History, they wrote, "Architecture speaks directly to the relationship between an organization and the society with which it plays its role. Society and social order shape the building. Architecture shapes the values, attitudes, and outlooks of the persons who use the buildings. Buildings impose themselves subtly on their users, influencing their emotions, shaping their behaviors, and affecting the quality of the activities and relationships within the structure." However, as we head towards the third decade of the 21st century, church architecture, like organized religion itself, has changed dramatically. Where we saw architectural designs like Classical Revival, Romanesque Revival, and Gothic Revival used in such architectures in the 19th century, it is seldom used anymore and really hasn't been popular for almost a century. With the development of new construction approaches, building materials, and technologies after World War I, architects and their church clients developed a preference for designs that were more cost-effective, useful, and simpler, permitting more functional, regular, and varied use of church space. For example, traditional chapels and sanctuaries are being replaced by auditoriums that create a theater-like religious experience for parishioners on Sunday, but also enable hosting of a myriad of other fellowship opportunities on other days of the week. Locally, Milton Bible Church would be a good example of this. Since the 1960s, most church exteriors have adopted a more subtle religious design in the modernistic and/or international styles, consistent with the ever-increasing focus by organized religious institutions on investing their limited resources on nurturing their congregations today while anticipating and adapting to their evolving spiritual needs in the future, all within the parameters of their individual doctrines. Local churches of a 19th century vintage will continue to help define our community's built form in both rural and urban Milton for some time to come, and remind us daily about our religious and social traditions from around the time of Confederation to Canada's centenary in 1967. But it is unlikely they will speak to the spirituality of most Canadians in the next 150 years. That said, as we have seen over the last 40 years locally, their use is evolving, and that, complemented by their aesthetic value, architectural significance, and historical pedigree, will continue to make them relevant to most, regardless of their religious affiliations, for generations to come. I'll now conclude my remarks with 10 things I'll bet you never knew about some of our Milton and area churches. So number 10. The establishment of Graceway Baptist Church at 103 Martin Street reestablished that building as a church, which is how it all began in July 1856 when it was founded as a free Presbyterian church. Number 9. Milton Bible Church was originally established in downtown Milton in 1935 as Milton Gospel Tabernacle. It met at the former Thompson Hotel. Number 8. 2 days after the current St. George's Anglican Church was dedicated on June 18, 1896, the minister's son fell down the well at the church rectory and drowned. Number 7. 17 years later, on Good Friday no less, the roof was blown off St. George's as well as at nearby St. John's Anglican Church. 6 years later, it happened again at St. George's. Number 6. The bronze sculpture in front of New Life Pentecostal Church was rendered by renowned international artist Tom White, who is best known for the figurative work he has done at the Billy Graham Library in Charlotte, North Carolina. Number 5. The Holy Transfiguration Serbian Orthodox Monastery in rural Milton is the only such monastery in Canada. Number 4. St. Peter's Mission Church, one of the oldest church congregations in Milton, is now located in Mississauga. Number 3. Hillcrest United Church was founded through the amalgamation of Ashgrove United Church and Hornby United Church, a union that occurred as an admittedly tongue-in-cheek suggestion by the late James Snow. Number 2. The current Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses was built on the same property as the building it replaced over a weekend in November 1991. Number 1. The Earl of Aberdeen, Governor General of Canada at the end of the 19th century, helped to place the cornerstone on June 4, 1895 at Grace Anglican Church in downtown Milton. Thank you.